Okay.
wherever you can locate it.
It is recording.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Mother's Day to everyone that celebrates. I'm Victoria Pilato, the Digital Projects Librarian at Stony Brook University Libraries. And I'd like to welcome you to the second talk in our lecture series, The Art of Relationships, sponsored jointly by the Stony Brook University Libraries and the Pollock-Krasner House and Study Center. The series, which complements the Pollock-Krasner House's current exhibition, Creative Exchanges, Artists in Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner's Address Books, is made possible by a generous gift from Dorothy Lichtenstein and Stony Brook's John H. Marburger III Memorial Fund. Now I'll turn things over to the Pollock-Krasner House Director, Helen Harrison, who will introduce today's speaker, Philip Rylands.
Thank you very much, Victoria. I really appreciate the support of the Stony Brook Libraries as co-hosts. And also I want to thank the Jason McCoy Gallery in New York City, which represents the Charles Pollock estate, for arranging the loan of his 1956 painting, Chapala 7, to the Creative Exchanges exhibition. This exhibition, which includes over 30 artists from Jackson and Lee's address books, is at the Pollock-Krasner House through July 30th and has a dedicated website, which I will put a link to that website in the chat. In 2015, when Philip Rylands was director of the Peggy Guggenheim collection in Venice, Italy, he organized a retrospective of Charles Pollock's work, while the mural that Jackson painted for Peggy was also on view. I had seen the mural before, but it was the first time I'd seen Charles's work in depth, and it gave me a new respect and appreciation for his artistic achievements, as well as the crucial role he played in Jackson's career. Now, Philip will share some of those insights with us today. After leaving the Peggy Guggenheim collection, where he was the founding administrator and director, and now serves as director emeritus, Philip moved to Palm Beach, Florida, to become the director and the president and CEO of the Society of the Four Arts. His publications include Flying the Flag for Art, the United States and the Venice Biennale, 1895 to 1991, written with Enzo DiMartino and published in 1993, and Peggy Guggenheim and Frederick Kiesler, The Story of Art of This Century, which he edited with Susan Davidson and was published in 2004. He also writes periodic reviews, and including those for the Burlington magazine. So now I will turn it over to Philip, who will tell us about Charles Pollock, Jackson's oldest brother.
Thank you, Helen. You can hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, indeed. I've curated two shows, one in Venice and at the Peggy Guggenheim collection, and one in Palm Beach, with work by Jackson Pollock, much helped by Otto and Kirsten Hubner and Jason McCoy. Here in Palm Beach at the Society of the Four Arts. But I've never actually pulled together a lecture on him, so I'm pleased to do so now. I'm going to pull up the there now. Can you see the screen?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So who was Charles Pollock? He was a man of immense and enviable integrity, a seriously fine artist, and the eldest of 5 brothers, of whom Jackson was the youngest. He was born in 1902 in Denver, Colorado. Jackson was born 10 years later in Cody, Wyoming, and this diversity of place gives you an idea of the peripatetic character of the Pollock family. Charles, as his daughter Francesca has suggested, she who now runs the Charles Pollock Archive in Paris, and who is the daughter of Sylvia, who took the photograph on the screen. Charles took responsibility for his brothers because of the frequent absences caused by their father's search for a paying job, while Jackson, as the baby, grew up, I think it's fair to say, undisciplined, irresponsible, sometimes reckless of others. Charles, in fact, aware that Jackson was drifting without any clear focus in his life, induced him to travel to New York in 1930 to join him joined Charles as a student of Thomas Hart Benton, and he continued in many ways in the 1930s to take responsibility for him until the time when, at the height of the Depression, Charles himself quit New York to take a government job in Washington. So the first question to answer is, what sort of painter was Charles? Terence Malone, the best critic of Charles Pollock and a superb writer, quoted from an unpublished note written by Charles in 1929. Painting and sculpture, Charles realized, had become detached from architecture in the 16th and 17th centuries in Amsterdam and Venice, and I quote, "Art for art's sake is necessary, and a new aesthetic and technique of appreciation will need to be evolved." Now, this is fairly remarkable. It identifies for us an artist who was intellectual, inquiring, and articulate. He had some understanding of art history, knowing as he did that Amsterdam and Venice had been capitals of the art market, causing art to be dissociated from architecture and contributing to the evolution of art as a commodity. Moreover, Charles by this time had a programmatic sense of what his challenges were, a new aesthetic and a new technique of appreciation. You see him here clearly earnest and sober, even while little brother Jackson postures for the camera lens. Now, that was Charles to fulfill his program. This put him down, in his own words, a long line, that of regionalism and social realism. And then, much later, from 1942, he switched to abstract painting in a moment of Damascene conversion. Thus, first a period of social realism. Charles moved to New York in 1926, and in 1928 became a student of Thomas Hart Benton at the Art Students League. He was, in fact, a favorite student and virtually entered the charismatic Hart Benton family, as did Jackson when 2 years later Charles brought him to New York and had him enroll in Benton's classes at the League. The earliest extant works by both Charles and Jackson are derived from Benton's teaching and his painting, whether in figure style and landscape composition or in subject matter, and even in the ambition to work on the scale of murals. Here are more small works on paper by Charles, and I've put these up in order to quote Terence Malone, who said, "It is fascinating to see how Charles crabbed his style and made it faux naif in the works he executed during the Depression. In other words, he subordinated his skills, his draftsmanly skills, to the style of his teacher." To the left and right, you see private sketches for his own pleasure. In the center, a small tempera instead, of which he was sufficiently satisfied to make a lithograph version in his more public, regionalist Bentonesque style. He was always a far greater draftsman of precision than Jackson ever was. These images also remind us that Charles crisscrossed America several times in the late 20s and 30s, usually with Jackson, and hopping trains as well as driving. And as he did so, he looked around him very much with regionalist eyes. This was the heyday of Benton's mural commissions. This one was for the New School of Social Research in New York, actually, I think his first major commission. And this was the place where in 1930, Charles exhibited for the first time. And it was quickly followed by vast canvases for the Whitney Museum and for the World's Fair in Chicago in 1933. In the summer of 1930, Charles and Jackson took the time and trouble to see this completed mural, Orozco's first United States commission. And it's generally agreed, and I think we all know, an imagery of the three great Mexican muralists, Orozco, Rivera, and Siqueiros, as well as their social commitment, were tremendously important to the two brothers. In 1933, both brothers tried their hand at designing Bentonesque murals for Greenwich House in New York. Greenwich House was founded in 1902 as a settlement house to support immigrants. The theoretical basis for Benton's teaching was a series of articles he had written titled The Mechanics of Form Organization. And although this eventually was an instrument for figure drawing that would expedite the execution of his murals, techniques that both Pollock brothers thoroughly learned, it also sounds and looks like a manual for the abstraction to which Charles was to turn in the 40s. I think it's fair to speculate that Benton's teachings about form stayed with Charles throughout his career, even when he renounces regionalism. And so the conclusions one might draw from this are, firstly, that even though Charles was committed to a new art and a new aesthetic, it is thoroughly understandable that homegrown small-town regionalism and a realist social conscience in subject matter could be perceived by Charles as new art of the moment, especially as it was in line with his sense that being an artist carried with it moral obligations to society. Secondly, as we shall see, that when Charles abandons realistic painting in favor of modernism and eventually pure abstract imagery, Benton's teaching carried over into the expressive power of the mark or the sign. The abstract seeming marks on the left uncannily hint at the marks in Charles's abstract painting years later. Socialism and communism were rife among thinking people in New York in the 1930s, and Charles and his partner Elizabeth, especially Elizabeth, were no exceptions. In 1935, Rita and Thomas Hart Benton left New York to settle in Missouri, in part abandoning Charles, if you like, and Jackson. This was a familial commitment to regionalism, if you wish, and Charles began casting around for some way of placing his artistic skills in the support of the poor and the working classes. This led to his move to Washington, D.C. the same year, in 1935, leaving behind him Jackson in particular and the New York art world in general. Charles joined the Resettlement Administration, which had been founded the same year as part of Roosevelt's efforts to mitigate the hardships of the Depression. This was the same bureau that commissioned photography from Dorothea Lange, Ben Shahn, and Walker Evans. Charles soon became disillusioned and quit the Resettlement Administration. He was charged with illustrating folk song music sheet covers and posters, but these were not much appreciated and failed to satisfy his need to be of help. They depicted what Elizabeth Pollock described as bone-worn workers, exhausted miners, burdened women, dying landscapes, and industrial ruins. So in 1937, Charles moves to Detroit with Elizabeth to work for the United Automobile Workers Union as assistant editor for the union newspaper. This marked the peak of Charles's sympathy for laborers and his activism in labor politics. He once again found that his art was of no meaningful use in the intense, even bloody struggles at that time between bosses and workers. You can read the poem here. It's a bitter version of the song Rockabye Baby. I'll actually read it for you quickly. Well, rockabye baby on the treetop. When you grow up, you'll work in a shop. When you are married, your wife will work too, so that the rich will have nothing to do. Hush-a-bye baby on the treetop. When you grow old, your wages will stop. When you have spent the little you've saved, first to the poorhouse, then to the grave. A wonderfully bitter thing, illustrated by Charles. This is the point for the UAW magazine. So in 1938, the restless Charles, still in Detroit, joined the Federal Art Project of the WPA as a supervisor of the mural division. Here is one he did for the Detroit Waterworks. See the dam in the center. Between 1941 and 44, Charles painted murals for Michigan State College. These are still highly Benton-esque. They even include Benton's episode dividers by means of wood moldings applied to the canvas. And though the themes seem banal enough, they have their quota of altruism. They coincide with a growing interest in the implications of freedom of creativity through manual labor. Charles was even influenced at this time by the writings of William Morris, he of the English arts and crafts movement in the late 19th century. And he quoted Morris in a lecture he gave in 1950 about the joy and pleasure of craft work. Charles's faith in the ideas of William Morris endured through the rest of his life. When, therefore, Michigan State College offered Charles a teaching position in its nascent art department, he chose to teach lettering and graphic design, and not realist murals of the kind he'd been doing for the previous several years. Charles's break with realist painting in favor of abstraction began after he had completed the Fairchild Auditorium murals. He was exhausted and disillusioned with the power of his art to improve the condition of the working classes. This was, in any case, the period of decline of regionalism. Thomas Hart Benton, also undergoing a crisis, attributed this to World War II. People, he said, were no longer interested in American values of the kind regionalism celebrated. This was the time that a young modernist replaced Grant Wood as director of the art department of the University of Iowa, and who accepted the gift of Jackson Pollock's 1943 mural from Peggy Guggenheim. Charles entered a period of serious self-doubt and questioning. This was almost exactly the time when Jackson, in far-off New York, was maturing his technique of poured and drip painting. Clearly, Charles was not going to go in that direction, as this essay in Cubism testifies. It was very much, it has very much the look of an artist working in an exploratory way towards abstraction. One thinks of Gorky, or across the Atlantic of Afro-Basildella in Italy, where Picasso-inspired Cubism was a widespread interim phase on the route to abstract expressionism. There is no hint of surrealism. This would have been alien to Charles's temperament. Here is another example, apparently a harlequin with a stringed instrument. And I'm going to quote rather vividly from Terence Malone at this point. He says, or writes, Charles was now painfully conscious that his art was prosaic, provincial, and in the fine analysis, not good enough to make the grade. His rehabilitation as an artist would require a huge mental adjustment, a much greater investment in subjectivity in his work, a heightening of sensitivity, an extension of his knowledge of painting in general and modern art in particular, and an increase in his critical powers. Now, this is perhaps the place to refer to a peculiar episode in Charles's life. Benton, when changing studios in New York, had given over to Charles's custody a suitcase that was full of abstract paintings, of drawings from his, Benton's, early career, when he was an exponent of synchronism. The movement the movement created by the brothers Stanton MacDonald Wright and Willard Huntington Wright, whom Benton had met in Paris in his very early formative days. Benton so strenuously rejected his modernist past that when in 1981 Charles put some of these early works up for sale at the Salander O'Reilly Gallery in New York, he was accused of betrayal to his early mentor. The irony consists in the fact that Benton rejected abstraction in favor of social realism, and Charles did the precise opposite. Meanwhile, Charles was practicing and teaching this sort of thing. Alphabets drawn by hand, calligraphy, lettering, typefaces, and so forth. There is a quirkiness which we now can see as typical of Charles. Imaginative and free touch. I'm referring to the S's on the left, and on the right to the spiky serifs like marching feet. Again to the red S, which is leaning forward, and to the characterful black A of wax to the right. Here is what Charles himself said of the matter. text that could as easily have been written by his contemporary in England, Eric Gill, the great letter cutter, typeface designer and sculptor. He said, where the typewriter is commonplace in commerce and the school, it may seem quixotic to advocate the learning of a respectable writing hand. But in an age where so little is left to individual man to cultivate as a worthwhile, wholly personal craft, it could be a modest beginning toward an understanding of beauty and form and expression in more complex things, a source of pure pleasure in good craftsmanship, practiced because it satisfies, if only in a small degree, man's basic instinct to create. Charles was strongly committed to his teaching in his typical altruistic way, to setting up the new design and calligraphy department at Michigan State, and this meant that he was now something of a part-time painter. Here are two etchings from the same plate that he made in 1949, possibly themselves the outcome of his teaching of artistic techniques. Here instead is what is perhaps his first fully accomplished abstract painting. It may seem close to a color burst by Jackson, but in effect, the calligraphic influence is strong. It is made up of innumerable marks and dabs, what avant-gardists at that time called tashes, or tache, in the French manner, each applied with the brush, with some hints of geometry here and there, including an upright triangle behind. It has a compositional core that steers shy of the margins, perhaps the habit of the printmaker, and it falls short of anything that might be described as action painting. If anything, it has a rather constricted European rather than American style of painterly abstraction. Rather soon after Fireworks, he produced a splendid series of ink abstractions on paper. The brushwork takes on a Chinese look, strengthened and supported by the independent cross-hatching shadows that generate the space in which the forms float. It's fair to think that his position on a university faculty gave him library access to a very wide range of world artistic traditions. In 1955 to 56, Charles was awarded a sabbatical, and he resolved to travel to Lake Chapala in Mexico, a country that had engaged his imagination since his teens. The solitude he endured enabled him to focus entirely on his painting and led to the first major body of easel paintings in his career, the so-called Chapala series. There is very little automatic spontaneity in these works, as carefully deliberated as one of his alphabets. They test over and over the formal and emotive values of different kinds of marks and color planes and tones. A non-verbal language of primitive signs and symbols reflective of the Mexican culture in which he was immersed. Here are two more works from the Chapala series, a diptych of splendor canvases of which he was particularly fond and which still belong to the Charles Pollock archive. There were also many drawings. They indicate for us that henceforth Charles worked in series, experimenting in format and type of figuration over and over until it was time to move on. Despite the Chapala accomplishment, Charles's career stalled for a few more years. In August 1956, only days after his return to Michigan, the tragedy of Jackson's premature death took place, even while Charles was enjoying the romance of his great love for Sylvia Wynter, his former student, who was to give him happiness for the rest of his life. There were difficulties to deal with, his teaching obligations, the divorce from his first wife, Elizabeth. But in 1958, his mother, Stella Pollock, dies. In October the same year, he himself is hospitalized with a heart attack. So it's hard to avoid seeing the tragic, the fear of death, whatever, in the somber tones and morbid shapes of the canvases he painted when once again he found time and the focus to work in 1959 to 60. This is an early example of the series, and you can surely see that the joyous marks of the Chapala series have disappeared. Here is another example. Some of these paintings are 6 feet in height and are truly majestic. Other colors he used were a dark mauve, an olive green, and an emptied out twilight pale blue. This work truly has the look of classic and early color field painting, of the kind that Clement Greenberg both advocated and named. They have strong affinities, though stylistically completely owned by Charles, with Rothko and Still. Charles and Sylvia had begun to frequent New York again. By 1960, they had been befriended by Clement Greenberg himself, and a year later they met Barnett Newman and Ken Noland, and indeed many others of the New York scene. They had, in a sense, engaged with the avant-garde for the first time, having until that time lived it vicariously by following Jackson's truncated career. It is a curiosity that the career of Charles begins in earnest only after the death of his brother Jackson, who was, after all, 10. Furthermore, a new sensibility to color that distinguished Charles's mature abstraction from his Benton years was nourished by the fact that Sylvia was studying under Joseph Albers at Yale at this time. This then was the style that, and even the mood, that Charles took with him to Italy and to Rome in 1962. It's inescapable to notice a Barnett Newman type zip that now splices the canvas. Charles's formal sensibility enabled him to use the motif to superb effect, as contrast, as structure, as spatial indicator and movement. These works, as well as the post-Rome works, as he titled them, which follow, show him returning to full-bodied hues of bright color, and I would suggest are some of his greatest masterpieces. Here is another example. The vertical line serves wonderfully to assert the full abstract nature of the image, neither a biological close-up nor an abstracted landscape nor some condition of the weather, but the embodiment of Apollinaire's original euphemism for abstraction, that of pure painting. Here, look, is one of the post-Rome series. This and the next slide are rarely accomplished and enduringly pleasing. They have a residual sense of geography and topography and landscape, even while the colors hold the tension between surface and pictorial space in perfect equilibrium. Here is another miracle of cogitated design. The cosmic circle is an absolute and astutely placed as one of Gottlieb's bursts. This, if you like, signals Charles's heyday. With a perfect marriage of form, color, and medium, they fully embody St. Thomas Aquinas's prescription for beauty, which Charles certainly knew, that of James Joyce's Stephen Dedalus, when he quotes wholeness, proportionality, and radiance, integritas, consonantia, and claritas. Pastels of the post-Roman series morph into what look like pure color exercises in using undulating vertical lines and occasional wedges, sometimes hard-edged and sometimes blurred, by diluting acrylic to the point that is absorbed into the unprepared canvas. These works, and forgive the rather clumsy illustrations, they're taken from my catalogue of the Venice show. These works coincide with Charles's retirement from Michigan State College in 1968 and immediately precede his emigration to Paris in 1971. Charles seems, in the series of stacked colored rectangles, to be aware, perhaps fortuitously, of Donald Judd. Charles and Sylvia had moved permanently to New York in 1968, but there they were disappointed to find that this did not seal any of the friendships he had made when he was just an occasional visitor, rather to the contrary, and he found that Clement Greenberg was of no help. At his age, he was a little curmudgeonly, and he found the New York art world too political and fraught. He even acquired a physical dislike of the dirt and violence in the city. Hence the move to Paris in 1971, even though the art world there had little to offer him. For Charles, the seclusion and relative peace that he and Sylvia eventually found in Paris left him able to work consistently for another full decade with formal, quote-unquote, research. This is a typical word used by Italian art writers and of the kind you see on the screen, formal ricerca. The arches of the title in this, by the way, are not an architectural reference, but a reference to the paper on which they were painted. I think if these drawings had been made at the start of his abstract period, they would seem mere exercises, warmers-up, for example. At the end of his life, and given their title of Last Drawings, they take on a cosmic significance, or at least a highly contemplative assessment of life and an unknown future. Charles dies in 1988 at the age of 85, and his ashes were placed in the Luxembourg Gardens. Now, there are three things I would like to add. Firstly, I'm constantly asked why one has never heard of Charles Pollock, when his brother Jackson has been described by some as the greatest American painter of the 20th century, or at least the most important one. This is changing, thanks to the efforts of his daughter, Francesca Pollock, and thank you to her for joining us. She of the beautifully run Charles Pollock Archives in Paris, and also to Jason McCoy in New York, and to Otto and Kirsten Hubner of the American Contemporary Art Gallery in Munich. Nevertheless, by quitting New York in 1935, he abandoned the modernist avant-garde even before it came into existence. His experience in his teens enabled him to take on paying positions as an illustrator and designer, which distracted him from the métier of fine art painter. And through 1968, he followed a selfless vocation as a teacher. In most people's experience, drains the creative fire, or at least consumes it in other ways. His first partner, Elizabeth England, doesn't seem to me to have been the sort of supportive wife that Lee Krasner was, nor indeed Charles's second wife, Sylvia Wynter, was. Elizabeth had, and quite rightly, her own goals and ambitions. Again, the trouble he experienced in the late 1950s, which caused a hiatus in his production after the Chapala paintings, had something of the calamity of missing the abstract expressionist boat. That Charles did not mature as an artist in New York, but instead in the Midwest, left him ill-equipped to deal with the New York art world when briefly he and Sylvia moved there in the late 60s. And finally, but perhaps most significantly, the reticence of his character and the lack of any driving ambition may have made him less than single-minded about market success. In 1982, he wrote to Hans Nemeth the following, and I shall quote again. "I have spent," Charles says, "I have spent more than 50 years as a serious painter without being known in the New York gallery world, and at 80, I am not sure I care very much about being known in that world now. In any case, I have no track record, stigma enough in the eyes of gallery and owners. Moreover, I don't know in what possible gallery I would be comfortable. There can't be many. It would have to be special. I am difficult. It can't be helped. Secondly, people ask how he viewed his brother Jackson. Now, you've seen enough of his art to understand that he never attempted to imitate or rival his brother. Although in general terms, Jackson's success in the late 40s as a painter of abstraction must have been an encouragement. But his abstraction came from a background of design and illustration and was the outcome of skilled draftsmanship and craftsmanship. He briefly, in 1952, took on a pseudonym, that of Charles Pima, to avoid confusion with his already successful brother, but he quickly dropped that. But it is a fact that throughout his life, he never expressed jealousy of his brother. He was always fraternal, sympathetic, and supportive. Finally, I want to draw attention to how Charles considered his painting ethical. This is something that Terence Malone stresses, he whom I have praised as the best interpreter and writer on Charles. We know that Charles was a thwarted political activist in his early years, working for the Resettlement Administration and the Detroit Auto Workers Union. But Malone's point is that Charles, thoughtful as he was, considered his abstract painting conjured up from human creativity. Its beauty and at times profundity was a palliative to the shallow values of the new affluent society. It was in itself an expression of human ethical values and a contribution to the sum of beautiful and worthy things on earth. So I will close by returning to what I said at the opening. Charles Pollock was a man of immense integrity and a seriously talented and undervalued artist. Thank you all. Let me stop the screen sharing.
Thank you so much, Philip. I learned so much from that, and I really enjoyed your observations about the art itself, that I think that there's a certain misunderstanding of why or how Charles came to abstraction. I think people assume that because Jackson's art went abstract, that he kind of followed him in an odd way. But I don't think that's true. From what you've given us, I really feel that he arrived at that conclusion independently and on his own terms. And maybe being in the Midwest was actually, in some ways, at least creatively, an advantage for him because he wasn't under the pressure that he would have been in New York.
Surely that's right, Helen. Yeah.
And if anyone has any questions or comments, please raise your hand or put them in the chat, and I will either read them from the chat or I will unmute you, or Victoria, one of us, will unmute you. I was just thinking, you said about his statement about not having a New York gallery. It strikes me that Andre Emmerich would have been a wonderful dealer for him, someone who would have understood his work and really promoted it well. But I guess by the time he was ready for that kind of exposure, he just wasn't up for it.
Well, Francesca might confirm, but William Rubin tried to promote Charles with Andre Emmerich, in fact, so you're quite right. William Rubin kind of let the ball drop and it just never happened, unfortunately. And I think Charles wasn't willing to tug on too many sleeves and so on. I think its pride was at stake. One way or another, he and Sylvia didn't find New York a welcoming place in the late 60s. And an attempt to
other artists as well who went to teach in the Midwest. I think Philip Guston also fell into that category for a while, who were, as you say, they missed the abstract expressionist boat when it sailed, and they had to play catch up for a while because they just hadn't been exposed in the same way.
Good point.
I see a comment from Denise Lassaw. She says, I think Ibram and Ernestine visited with Charles in 1979 when they went to Paris for the Autour de Jackson Pollock show. I saw some postcards in my files. So that's interesting that they were able to reconnect at least with one New York couple who were their friends when they came back to the city.
That's nice to know.
Do we have any other comments or questions? Let me see, I don't see any hands up, but in which case I will thank everyone for being with us today. And I hope also, by the way, the exhibition from 2015 at the Guggenheim is still up on their website. So if you want to see some installation photos of that show, you can go to the Peggy Guggenheim Collection website and find them there. And I will mention that next week, we will have Elizabeth Smith, who is the executive director of the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation. And she will be telling us about Helen's early work in the 1950s. And the Frankenthaler Foundation is responsible, excuse me, for lending us a beautiful 1951 Frankenthaler painting called Cloudscape, which is in the Creative Exchanges exhibition. So thank you again all for joining us. Thank you so much, Philip. Thank you for Francesca for coming on all the way from Paris. And we will see you, I hope, next week. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.